It started at a family anniversary dinner under warm lights and polite smiles, the kind of night meant to prove nothing was broken. My parents' living room was filled with framed photographs of my younger sister, every milestone carefully preserved, when my mother leaned down, looked directly at my 6-year-old daughter and said without hesitation that she didn't need to call them grandma or grandpa. No argument, no anger, just a sentence placed carefully like a decision already made. The room went quiet. My daughter tightened her hand around mine and whispered a question no child should have to ask about where she belongs. That moment didn't just end a celebration. It reopened a lifetime of quiet comparisons, a wedding my parents never attended, years of being told I was imagining things, and a final attempt to control my family through my husband. This isn't a story about one cruel comment. It's about how easily a family can erase a child, and how dangerous it is when a mother is expected to stay silent for the sake of appearances. If you're still listening, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Your presence matters more than you know. And if stories like this resonate with you, you're welcome to stay with us by subscribing. Thank you for giving me these moments of your time. The dinner was meant to be simple. My parents had framed it as a small anniversary gathering, nothing extravagant, just family food and the familiar obligation to show up smiling. Their house in Boulder looked the same as it always had: clean lines, neutral colors, everything arranged to suggest calm and stability. From the outside, it was the kind of home people assumed held no secrets. Inside, the air felt tight, like it always did when everyone was pretending too hard. I arrived holding Nora's hand, already doing the quiet calculations I'd learned as a child. How long could we stay before she got tired? Where should we sit so she wouldn't be in the way? How much of myself needed to disappear to keep the night smooth? Nora wore the blue dress she loved, the one she said made her feel grown up. She had practiced saying hello in the car, her voice careful, hopeful. I told myself that meant something. The walls were covered in photographs. Not of all of us, just Paige. Paige at 16, Paige at graduation, Paige at charity events. Paige smiling beside people whose names I didn't know, but whose approval my parents clearly valued. There were no pictures of my wedding. None of Nora as a baby. I noticed it the way you notice a missing stair, quickly, instinctively, without comment. Calling it out would have made me the problem. Dinner moved along the way it always did. Polite conversation, safe topics. My parents asked Nora about school with the same detached curiosity they might show a neighbor's child. She answered earnestly, trying to impress them. Every time she spoke, I felt a small knot tighten in my chest because I knew how easily that effort could be dismissed. Then it happened. Not in anger. Not during an argument. My mother leaned down, her voice even almost gentle, and said the sentence that would split everything in half. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look at me. She spoke as if stating a preference about table settings. My father said nothing. Paige didn't react at all. The silence that followed was so complete it felt intentional. Nora looked up at me, confusion written across her face. She wasn't crying. She wasn't upset yet. She was trying to understand a rule she just learned existed. When she whispered her question, I felt something inside me give way. Not dramatically, not all at once, but with the dull certainty of something breaking that can't be fixed. I smiled for her. That was instinct. That was training. I told her we'd talk later, that everything was fine. I told myself the same lie I'd used my entire life. But as I sat there nodding along to conversation that had resumed without pause, I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was a boundary being enforced. A decision already made. I thought back to my own childhood, to how often love had been measured and rationed. Paige had always fit easily into the image my parents wanted to present. She was charming, photogenic, easy to explain to others. I had been quieter, more complicated. Something to manage rather than showcase. I learned early that approval came in small doses and could be withdrawn without warning. As the evening went on, I watched my parents interact with Nora the way they always had, pleasant but distant, careful not to invite attachment. I understood then that what I'd spent years internalizing wasn't just about me, it was a system, and my daughter had just been placed inside it. Driving home, Nora fell asleep in the back seat, her small body finally relaxed. I kept my eyes on the road, replaying the night in fragments. I asked myself the questions I'd avoided for years. How many times had I excused behavior that crossed a line? How often had I told myself it wasn't that bad because no one was shouting? And how much of that silence had I inherited and passed on? That night, after carrying Nora to bed and sitting beside her until her breathing evened out, I understood something with painful clarity. Protecting the peace had always come at a cost. I had just never let myself calculate who was paying it. This time, the answer was unmistakable, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I didn't grow up believing my parents were cruel. That would have been easier to name, easier to resist. What I grew up with was something quieter, a steady awareness that there was a correct way to exist, and that I never quite occupied it. Paige did. Paige always did. She learned early how to smile at the right moments, how to speak with confidence that made adults lean in instead of away. When people praised her, my parents glowed. When people praised me, they nodded polite and contained as if compliments were something to be acknowledged and then quickly put away. There were no dramatic comparisons, no speeches about disappointment. The hierarchy was established through tone and timing. Paige's achievements were announced at dinner. Mine were mentioned later, almost as an afterthought. When she won something, the house shifted, voices lifted, plans were made, photos were framed. When I did well, it was treated as expected behavior, proof that I was functioning, not excelling. I learned to read those differences before I had words for them. I chose information technology because it made sense to me. Systems, logic, problems with clear inputs and outputs. It was a field where effort translated into results, where performance could be measured without interpretation. I studied quietly, worked part-time, and graduated without ceremony. My father said it was practical. My mother asked whether it would interfere with future plans she never defined. The conversation moved on. That same year, Paige signed a small promotional contract with a local fashion brand. It wasn't a career yet, just photos and appearances, but it was visible, shareable. My parents hosted a dinner. They invited friends. They talked about potential, about doors opening. I sat at the table smiling and felt something inside me flatten. Not jealousy exactly, more like resignation. I had already learned which milestones were worth celebrating. Over time, I adjusted. I made myself easier. I learned when to speak, and when silence would be rewarded. I learned to preempt criticism by anticipating it. If I stayed small enough, I could avoid being corrected. If I stayed helpful enough, I could avoid being noticed. It worked in the way survival strategies often do. The house stayed calm. No one accused me of causing trouble. I was praised for being low maintenance, a phrase that sounded like approval, but felt like erasure. When I met Owen years later, I didn't recognize the shift right away. We were at a software conference in Salt Lake City, standing near the back of a crowded room, both clearly trying to avoid small talk. He asked me what I worked on. I answered. He listened. Not in the polite way people do when they're waiting to respond, but with actual attention. He didn't ask why I'd chosen that path, or whether I planned to pivot into something more impressive. He didn't mention Paige. He didn't even know she existed. That absence felt strange, disorienting. I kept waiting for the moment when I'd need to explain myself, justify my choices, soften my ambitions so they wouldn't sound threatening. It never came. Over time, I realized I wasn't being evaluated. I was being accepted exactly where I stood. It was unfamiliar enough to make me suspicious. When I told my mother I was pregnant, her reaction was immediate and sharp. She didn't ask how I felt or whether I was ready. She told me I was making a mistake, that having a child would limit my options, that timing mattered. I heard the subtext clearly. This wasn't part of the image. I hung up the phone and sat in silence, one hand resting on my stomach, trying to reconcile the fear she'd planted with the certainty I felt. Owen proposed in our kitchen, no audience, no performance. Just the two of us, the smell of coffee still in the air. I said yes, without hesitation. When I called my parents to share the news, my father asked how Paige had reacted. It wasn't framed as curiosity. It was an assumption that her response was the axis everything turned on. I answered anyway. I always did. Looking back, I can see how carefully I'd been trained to orbit someone else's gravity. How naturally I'd learned to measure my happiness against its impact on Paige. I didn't question it because it had always been this way. It felt normal, familiar, safe in its own restrictive way. Sitting at my parents' anniversary dinner years later, watching Nora absorb a lesson I'd spent a lifetime internalizing, I finally understood the cost of that normalization. What I had endured quietly had not ended with me. It had simply been waiting for a new target. And once I saw that clearly, I knew the pattern wouldn't stop on its own. I sent the wedding invitations months in advance. Paper first, thick cardstock, simple design, nothing extravagant. Then emails just in case something got lost. I checked the addresses twice. I remember standing at the kitchen counter sealing envelopes while Nora colored beside me, humming to herself. At the time, I still believed that if I did everything carefully enough, no one could claim confusion later. No one responded. Not yes. Not no. Nothing at all. I told myself they were busy. I told myself they would reach out closer to the date. I told myself all the familiar things I'd learned to say when silence needed explaining. Owen noticed, but he didn't push. He trusted me to handle my family the way I always had, quietly, without escalation. The morning of the wedding arrived clear and cold. The venue was small, tucked against the foothills outside Boulder. Nothing dramatic. Just a clean room, winter light, rows of chairs set close enough to feel intimate. I got dressed in a side room, adjusting fabric that felt suddenly too thin, too exposed. I kept checking the doorway, half expecting my parents to appear at the last minute. Apologies, ready smiles, practiced. They didn't. When I walked down the aisle, I didn't look at the empty seats meant for them until I was already halfway through. Seeing them then, two neat rows untouched, felt like stepping into a space where sound had been removed. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. I had learned how to move forward even when something essential was missing. Nora walked just ahead of me, holding a small basket she took very seriously. She was focused, determined not to trip, her face set in concentration. People smiled at her as she passed. She smiled back, proud of her role. I wondered what she was already learning about who showed up and who didn't. The ceremony itself was gentle. Owen's voice was steady. Mine was too. We promised each other things that felt real, not aspirational. Support, honesty, protection. When it was over, people hugged us, congratulated us, asked about our families. I answered vaguely. I had perfected vague. At the reception, Nora sat beside me, swinging her legs under the table. She leaned in close and asked quietly whether she should go say hello to my parents if they arrived later. The question wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was practical. I felt the weight of it settle into my chest anyway. I told her we'd see. I told her sometimes plans change. I didn't tell her that some people choose absence as a form of communication. I didn't have the language for that yet. They never came. In the weeks that followed, my mother called as if nothing unusual had happened. She asked about the weather, about work, about whether Nora was adjusting to school. When I asked why they hadn't attended, she sounded surprised. genuinely offended. She said they never received an invitation, that she would never miss something like that intentionally, that if I'd wanted them there, I should have made sure they knew. I showed her the emails. I described the envelopes. I listed dates. The conversation shifted immediately. Her tone hardened. She accused me of keeping score, of being dramatic, of turning a misunderstanding into an accusation. I apologized before I realized what I was doing. Habit is a difficult thing to break. But something had changed. Not loudly. Not all at once. I could feel it in the way I replayed the conversation afterward, noticing the places where facts had been bent to serve comfort. I recognized the pattern with a clarity I hadn't allowed myself before. When reality threatened the image, reality was the problem. What stayed with me most was Nora's quiet attentiveness in the days after. She didn't ask more questions, but she watched closely. She noticed when my phone rang and I stepped away. She noticed when I hesitated before answering questions about family. Children understand absence long before they understand explanation. I started to wonder how many of my own instincts had been shaped by moments like this. How many times I'd learned not to expect follow-through, not to demand clarity, not to take up space when something hurt. I wondered what I was modeling for her, simply by enduring. The anniversary dinner came months later, framed as a chance to reconnect, to move forward. I agreed to go because part of me still hoped effort could compensate for pattern. I dressed Nora carefully. I reminded myself to stay calm, to be gracious, to keep things light. Sitting there watching her try so earnestly to belong in a room that had never made space for her, I understood something I hadn't been ready to name before. The distance hadn't started with one missed wedding. It hadn't started with one comment. It had been building quietly for years, reinforced every time I explained away behavior that didn't deserve explanation. By the time my mother spoke to Nora that night, the groundwork had already been laid. All she did was say out loud what had always been implied. And in that moment, I knew the story I'd been telling myself, that this was manageable, survivable, something I could contain, was no longer true. After the anniversary dinner, my mother waited 3 days before calling. That timing felt deliberate. Long enough for the shock to settle. Short enough to suggest normalcy. When I answered, her voice carried the same practiced calm I'd grown up with, the tone that implied reason, maturity, and restraint. She didn't mention what she'd said to Nora. She didn't ask how we were doing. She started by talking about traffic, about how busy the week had been, as if nothing significant had occurred. When I brought it up carefully, she sighed. Not heavily, just enough to signal inconvenience. She said I was misinterpreting things, that I was sensitive, that I always had been. She explained that what she meant was practical, not personal, that titles were confusing, that expectations create disappointment. The words slid into place with familiar precision, each one positioned to make the problem feel smaller than it was. I told her what Nora had asked me on the drive home. I told her how quiet she'd been since. There was a pause on the line, but it wasn't the kind that holds emotion. It was the pause of someone deciding how much engagement a topic deserves. Then my mother said something that landed harder than the original comment. "You're projecting," she said. "She's 6. She'll forget." That sentence rearranged something inside me. Not sharply, not dramatically. It simply clarified the hierarchy. Nora's feelings were temporary. My reaction was inconvenient. Their comfort was permanent. I felt the urge to apologize rise automatically, the reflex to smooth over tension I'd practiced for decades. I stopped myself mid-breath. I asked her why the photos on their walls were only of Paige, why they'd never framed a picture of Nora, why they hadn't come to my wedding. I asked slowly, evenly, the way you do when you're trying not to provoke defensiveness. My mother's voice cooled immediately. She said I was making everything into an accusation, that families don't keep score, that she didn't understand why I was trying to start a fight. I wasn't. I was trying to locate reality. She ended the call by saying we should all take some time to calm down. The implication was clear emotions were the problem, not behavior. I sat at the kitchen table after we hung up, staring at the wood grain, feeling something unfamiliar settle in my chest. It wasn't anger. It was recognition. Over the next few weeks, small things began to surface. An aunt asked me gently why my parents hadn't been at my wedding. A cousin mentioned hearing that invitations must have gotten lost. The story had already been shaped, smoothed into something palatable. No one accused me outright, but the suggestion lingered that misunderstandings happen, that intentions matter more than outcomes, that it's best not to dwell. I realized then that the lie wasn't just for me, it was for everyone. It preserved the image. It allowed my parents to remain reasonable, wronged even. And it positioned me once again as the source of unnecessary tension. I recognized the pattern with a clarity that surprised me. I'd been living inside it for years without naming it. Nora didn't talk about the dinner, but she asked more questions in general. About why some families live together and others don't. About why some people come to birthday parties and others send cards. She watched closely when I spoke to my parents on the phone, studying my face the way children do when they're trying to map emotional terrain. I answered honestly without oversharing. I chose my words carefully, aware that everything I said was becoming part of her understanding of the world. I thought about the wedding again, the empty seats, the unanswered invitations, the way I'd accepted silence as a form of communication. I thought about how easily I'd explained it away. How willing I'd been to absorb disappointment quietly so no one else had to feel uncomfortable. I understood now that what I'd called patience had often been self-erasure. The realization didn't come with relief. It came with grief. Grief for the version of myself that had believed effort could fix imbalance. Grief for the years I'd spent negotiating for scraps of approval. And grief for the fact that my daughter had been introduced to that system without my consent. One evening, Owen asked me how long I planned to keep explaining things away. Not accusingly, not impatiently. Just a question offered without pressure. I didn't have an answer. I only knew that something fundamental had shifted. That once a pattern is seen clearly, it loses its ability to hide behind intention. My parents continued to act as though nothing had changed. They sent a gift for Nora weeks later, a generic toy still in its packaging, mailed without a note. I thanked them. Then I sat with the discomfort of realizing how automatic that response still was. I began to understand that the truth I was circling wasn't about malice. It was about priority, about who was protected and who was expected to adapt. The story I'd been told, that love was equal but expressed differently, no longer held up under scrutiny. The evidence was too consistent. By the time Paige's name started appearing more frequently in conversations again tied to new plans and new celebrations, I felt braced in a way I hadn't before. Not defensive, just awake. I knew the next chapter was coming, and this time I wasn't willing to pretend I didn't recognize the shape of it. Paige's engagement was announced the way important things always were in my family, loudly, proudly, and with immediate expectations attached. My mother called to tell me the news as if it were a shared victory, her voice bright in a way I recognized instantly. She spoke about the ring first, then the location, then the guest list. Newport Beach. Ocean views. A financial consultant fiancé with the right last name and the right connections. Each detail was delivered carefully, like a resume being read aloud. I congratulated Paige when she texted me later. I kept it short. Neutral. She responded with a heart emoji and nothing else. That was the extent of our exchange. It felt appropriate. The planning escalated quickly. There were pre-events, dinners, fittings, engagement parties scheduled months in advance. My parents spoke about these gatherings with renewed energy, as if the past year hadn't happened. As if the absence at my wedding, the comments at the anniversary dinner, the quiet recalibration of boundaries had all been imaginary. They talked about family unity while making plans that excluded my child without hesitation. Nora wasn't invited to any of it. When I asked why carefully without accusation, my mother didn't hesitate. She said children change the atmosphere, that formal events weren't appropriate, that Paige's wedding needed to look a certain way. She said it kindly, almost apologetically, as if she were explaining a seating arrangement rather than the deliberate exclusion of her granddaughter. I thanked her for explaining. Then I sat with the weight of how easily my daughter had been categorized as a liability. Word traveled the way it always does. An aunt asked me whether Nora would be the flower girl. A cousin assumed she'd be involved somehow. I didn't correct them directly. I told them the truth plainly and without embellishment. That we hadn't been invited. That children weren't included. That was all. I didn't editorialize. I didn't speculate. I let the facts stand on their own. The reactions were subtle but noticeable. Pauses. Questions that stopped mid-sentence. A few quiet acknowledgments that didn't go any further. No one confronted my parents directly, but the narrative no longer flowed as smoothly. The story they'd prepared, that everything was fine, that misunderstandings had been resolved, didn't hold up under repetition. My parents noticed the shift before I did. They began reaching out more frequently, their messages laced with disappointment and accusation disguised as concern. They said I was creating distance, that I was making things uncomfortable, that Paige deserved to enjoy her moment without tension. The implication was familiar harmony was my responsibility, and disruption was a choice I was actively making. For the first time, I didn't rush to correct the discomfort. I thought about how often I'd been asked to adjust my tone, my expectations, my presence to accommodate someone else's happiness. I thought about how easily my own milestones had been minimized in the name of keeping things smooth. And I thought about Nora, who had done nothing wrong except exist in a family that valued presentation over connection. Paige eventually reached out directly. Her message was longer than usual, framed as advice. She said I needed to stop reading into things, that our parents were under stress, that weddings were complicated. She suggested I talk to Owen, have him help me see the bigger picture. It was the first time she'd referenced him directly, and the intent was clear. She wasn't asking for understanding, she was asking for compliance. I didn't respond right away. I read the message several times, noticing how carefully responsibility was shifted, how concern was used to disguise control. When I finally answered, I told her I wasn't trying to ruin anything, that I was simply telling the truth when asked, that I wasn't managing the story anymore. She didn't reply. A day later, Owen told me Paige had contacted him. Her message to him was polite, professional, and unmistakably condescending. She asked him to help keep things calm, to remind me of timing, of priorities. Owen read it once, then handed me his phone. He didn't ask what I wanted to do. He simply said he'd already responded. He told her that our family didn't need permission to exist, that decisions involving our child weren't up for negotiation, that if calm required silence, then calm wasn't the goal. His response was brief, final. He blocked her number afterward without comment. That night, Nora slept curled against me, her breathing steady, her small hand resting on my arm. I watched her for a long time, thinking about how easily children absorb unspoken hierarchies, about how quickly they learn when they are welcome and when they are tolerated. I promised myself quietly, without ceremony, that she wouldn't have to learn that lesson here. The engagement parties continued without us. Photos appeared online, smiles, champagne, carefully curated joy. My parents commented enthusiastically, tagging relatives, reinforcing the image. I didn't engage. I didn't explain. I didn't defend. I let the distance solidify into something intentional. I understood then that this wasn't about winning an argument or proving a point. It was about choosing where my energy went. about refusing to contort my reality to protect someone else's comfort. The control they'd relied on, the expectation that I would eventually fold, was failing, and without that leverage, there was nothing left to negotiate. The messages from my parents changed after that. The tone sharpened, though the words stayed polite. They stopped asking questions and started issuing conclusions. I was being selfish. I was creating unnecessary distance. I was letting resentment color my judgment. Each message arrived framed as concern, but the subtext was unmistakable. I was failing at my role. For most of my life, that kind of pressure would have worked. I would have searched for the right phrasing, the right compromise, the smallest concession that might restore balance without demanding accountability. This time, something held steady. I read the messages once, then set my phone down. I noticed how my body responded, not with panic, but with a quiet refusal to move. When I finally replied, I didn't argue details. I didn't defend my tone. I said what I had never allowed myself to say out loud. That I wasn't jealous of Paige, that I wasn't angry about the wedding, that what hurt was simpler and heavier than that. I told them I had spent my entire life watching affection flow past me like something reserved for someone else, that I had learned to accept it because it was all I'd known, and that seeing my daughter placed in the same position had made that acceptance impossible. I mentioned Nora by name. I described the moment she asked me what to call them. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't add commentary. I let the image stand on its own. There was a long pause before my father responded. When he did, his words were clipped, almost clinical. He said I was overanalyzing, that I had always been prone to exaggeration, that I was turning a minor comment into a narrative. Reading that, I felt something unexpected relief. Not because the words were kind, but because they were honest. The dismissal was complete. There was no attempt to soften it, no effort to meet me halfway. For the first time, the pattern revealed itself without disguise. I realized then how much of my silence had been mistaken for agreement, how often restraint had been interpreted as consent. The clarity was unsettling, but it was also grounding. It gave me something solid to stand on. Paige sent a message shortly after, shorter than usual, stripped of advice and empathy. She said I was embarrassing the family, that people were talking, that this wasn't the time to air grievances. The phrasing was familiar, almost rehearsed. I recognized it as language borrowed from our parents, handed down the way expectations always were. I didn't respond. That silence, chosen rather than enforced, felt different. It didn't carry fear. It carried finality. My parents tried again the following week, suggesting a call to clear the air. I declined. Not angrily, not dramatically. I said I wasn't ready to have a conversation that began with minimizing my child. I said that until Nora was treated as part of the family, there was nothing to resolve. The response was immediate and dismissive. They said I was issuing ultimatums, that I was holding relationships hostage. I sat with that accusation for a long time. I turned it over carefully, the way I do with difficult code, testing its logic. Was I demanding something unreasonable? Was I using access as leverage? The answer came slowly but clearly. I wasn't asking for special treatment. I was asking for baseline respect. And I wasn't withholding anything. I was stepping back from harm. The realization didn't make the loss easier. It made it cleaner. In the weeks that followed, my parents attempted to reframe the situation with extended family. They spoke about stress, about misunderstandings, about how hard it was to communicate these days. Some people accepted that explanation without question, others didn't. I heard fragments through quiet channels, comments made at gatherings we weren't attending, questions asked and left unanswered. The story was no longer fully under their control. What surprised me most was how little I felt compelled to intervene. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't clarify. I let the truth exist without my narration. It didn't need embellishment. It didn't need defense. At home, life narrowed to what mattered. Mornings with Nora, evenings spent drawing at the kitchen table, ordinary routines that felt suddenly intentional. Owen didn't ask for updates. He didn't need them. His support wasn't loud or performative. It was present, consistent, unconditional. One night, as I tucked Nora into bed, she asked me if families could change. The question was quiet, almost casual, but I heard the weight underneath it. I told her the truth as I understood it. That some families change when they're willing to listen. That others don't. And that either way, it wasn't her responsibility to make them better. She nodded, satisfied. Children don't always need answers. Sometimes they just need permission. Lying awake later, I thought about how long it had taken me to grant myself the same. How many years I'd spent negotiating for space that should have been offered freely. The silence from my parents no longer felt like punishment. It felt like confirmation. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for understanding. I wasn't hoping for repair. I was simply moving forward, guided by something steadier than obligation. The decision to stop explaining had closed a door I'd been holding open my entire life, and though the quiet on the other side was unfamiliar, it was finally mine. The absence that followed wasn't dramatic. There were no final messages, no declarations of estrangement. Just a slow thinning of contact, like a signal fading until it stopped registering altogether. I noticed it most in the quiet spaces, the moments when I instinctively reached for my phone and then remembered there was no one on the other end waiting to hear from me. My parents didn't apologize. They didn't revisit what had been said. They didn't ask about Nora. When they did reach out, it was indirect, practical. A forwarded article, a reminder about an upcoming date. Communication stripped of relationship, reduced to logistics. It felt deliberate, a way to maintain distance without naming it. At first, I waited. Not consciously, but with the kind of background anticipation that comes from years of conditioning. I expected a reset. A call framed as concern. A chance to smooth things over without addressing the real issue. It never came. The longer the silence stretched, the more I understood it as a choice. One afternoon, my mother sent a message saying she didn't recognize the person I'd become, that she was worried I was losing perspective. The words were familiar enough to feel rehearsed. I read them once, then again, noticing what wasn't there. No curiosity, no accountability. Just a suggestion that my boundaries were evidence of instability. I typed a response and erased it. Then I typed another. I imagined the conversation that would follow, how each sentence would be reframed, how each feeling would be categorized as excess. I deleted the message entirely and set the phone down. The relief that followed was immediate and unsettling. I realized how often I had apologized for existing outside their expectations. How frequently I had explained my intentions, clarified my tone, softened my words to avoid discomfort. I had confused patience with obligation, endurance with virtue. The recognition didn't arrive with anger. It arrived with fatigue. That evening, Owen found me at the kitchen table, staring at nothing in particular. He didn't ask what was wrong. He sat beside me, present without pressure. After a while, I told him I felt like I was failing at being a daughter. He listened, then said something simple that stayed with me. He said that roles only matter when they don't require harm to maintain. I thought about that long after he went to bed. I thought about how often harm had been normalized as necessary. How often I'd been told that discomfort was part of love, that family required sacrifice even when the cost was invisible to everyone else. The next time my parents reached out, it was to suggest we move on. No reference to what had happened. No acknowledgement of Nora. Just a desire to reset without repair. I read the message slowly, feeling the old reflex rise, the urge to agree, to minimize, to accept the terms offered. Instead, I replied with one sentence. I said that moving on without addressing the exclusion of my child wasn't possible, that I wasn't asking for understanding. I was asking for respect. The response came quickly. They said I was playing the victim, that I was choosing to be hurt, that families don't function when one person insists on making everything about themselves. The words were sharp enough to sting, but they no longer cut in the same way. I could see them for what they were: deflection, polished by repetition. For the first time, I didn't argue. I didn't counter. I didn't ask them to see my side. I thanked them for their honesty and ended the conversation. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, just a clean stop. Afterward, I sat alone in the living room, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the ordinary sounds of a house settling into night. I expected to feel regret, panic, a sense of irreversible loss. Instead, I felt something steadier take hold. Not happiness, not relief, something closer to alignment. I understood then that apologies offered under pressure aren't apologies, that reconciliation without accountability is just repetition, and that protecting my child required more than intention. It required action. Nora noticed the change before I named it. She asked why we didn't talk to my parents as much anymore. I told her the truth in language she could hold. That sometimes adults make choices that aren't safe for others. That it's okay to take space from people who don't treat you kindly, even if they're family. She listened, nodded, and went back to her coloring. Children accept clarity when it's offered without fear. That night, as I watched her sleep, I felt the weight of a decision settle fully into place. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't hoping for permission. I had stopped apologizing not just to my parents but to myself. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was intentional. It marked the boundary between who I had been taught to be and who I was choosing to become. And once that line was drawn, there was no reason to explain it to anyone who refused to see it. Paige reached out late one evening, long after I had stopped expecting her name to appear on my screen. The message was careful, structured the way professional emails are when they're meant to sound personal. She said she was concerned. She said she understood emotions were running high. She said she wanted to help bring things back to normal. The word normal sat there undefined, carrying all the assumptions I'd grown up with. She didn't mention Nora. She didn't reference what had been said at the anniversary dinner. She framed the situation as a misunderstanding that had spiraled unnecessarily. She suggested we all sit down together after the wedding once things had calmed down. Timing again was presented as the obstacle, not behavior. I read the message twice, noticing how responsibility was distributed. My parents were stressed. Paige was overwhelmed. The wedding was complicated. And I, implicitly, was the variable that needed adjusting. The expectation wasn't hidden. It was simply dressed in concern. I didn't reply right away. I put my phone down and watched Nora line up her stuffed animals on the living room floor, narrating a story only she understood. She looked peaceful, unburdened. I thought about how easily that peace could be disrupted by people who believed proximity entitled them to influence. When I finally responded to Paige, I kept it short. I told her I wasn't interested in returning to a version of normal that required my child to be minimized. I told her I wasn't asking anyone to take sides. I was stepping out of a pattern that no longer worked for me. That was all. Her reply came quickly. The tone shifted. She accused me of making everything about myself. She said I was trying to punish our parents. She said I didn't understand how families functioned under pressure. The concern evaporated, replaced by irritation. I recognized that shift immediately. It was the sound of control failing. The next morning, Owen told me Paige had contacted him. She'd sent a message asking him to help keep things from getting worse. She suggested he talk to me, encourage me to be more flexible, remind me of the importance of timing and appearances. She framed it as support. He read it once, then closed the app. He didn't ask me what I wanted to do. He didn't offer advice. He told her that decisions involving our family were not open for negotiation, that Nora's presence in our lives wasn't conditional, and that involving him in an attempt to override me was inappropriate. His response was brief, clear, and final. Paige didn't reply. That afternoon I blocked her number. Not impulsively. Not in anger. I did it the way you close a door when a room is no longer safe. Quietly. Without announcement. I felt a momentary hesitation, years of conditioning urging me to reconsider, to leave the line open just in case. I ignored it. My parents tried once more after that. A message from my father, formal and distant, asking whether I was prepared to repair the damage before it became permanent. The phrasing was precise. Damage in his view was discomfort. Permanence was my refusal to comply. I didn't respond. Over the following weeks, the narrative they had maintained began to shift. Not dramatically, subtly. I heard about it secondhand through people who had always been careful with their words around me. My parents had tried to explain my absence, to frame it as stress, misunderstanding, oversensitivity. But stories lose coherence when repeated too often without evidence. Relatives began comparing notes. Not openly, not confrontationally, but in the quiet way people do when something doesn't sit right. Someone mentioned a similar experience. Someone else acknowledged long-standing favoritism they'd never named. The image my parents relied on, reasonable, balanced, misunderstood, started to blur at the edges. Support for Paige's wedding shifted accordingly. Not everyone withdrew, but enthusiasm cooled. Some offers were quietly rescinded. Some commitments softened. There was no public reckoning, just a gradual recalibration. I observed it from a distance without satisfaction or regret. It wasn't my doing. It was the natural consequence of truth, moving without interference. At home, life settled into something steadier. Evenings were quiet. Owen cooked while Nora and I drew at the table, her crayons spreading across the surface in bright, unrestrained lines. She laughed easily. She slept deeply. I noticed how her body relaxed in ways it hadn't before, how the tension I hadn't realized she carried began to lift. I thought about how often I'd mistaken endurance for strength. How long I'd believed that holding everything together was my responsibility alone. Blocking Paige felt less like rejection and more like completion. The final step in choosing clarity over chaos. The truth didn't need my protection anymore. It had already begun to stand on its own. The weeks leading up to Paige's wedding passed without incident. No last-minute apologies. No attempts at reconciliation. The quiet held. At first, I kept waiting for something to break it. A message framed as urgency, a call insisting on closure, but nothing came. The absence felt deliberate now, not neglectful. It had shape, intention. Through scattered updates that reached me anyway, I learned my parents were struggling to maintain the version of events they'd prepared. They spoke carefully, repeating the same explanations, but repetition has a way of exposing its own seams. People began to ask gentle questions. Why hadn't I been there? Why wasn't Nora included? The answers shifted slightly each time. Stress, timing, misunderstandings, none of it quite held. I didn't correct anyone, I didn't clarify. I let the facts exist without commentary. That choice surprised me most of all. For years I'd believed that if I didn't manage the narrative, it would turn against me. Now I watched it move on its own, reshaping itself around what people could see plainly. Support for the wedding changed in small ways. A cousin declined a role she'd initially accepted. An aunt scaled back her involvement. Nothing dramatic enough to name, just enough to notice. My parents seemed unsettled by it, though they never said so directly. Control once loosened is difficult to reclaim. On the day of the ceremony, I didn't check my phone. Owen and I took Nora to the park near our house. The grass was still damp from morning irrigation. She ran ahead, stopping to examine every leaf, every uneven patch of ground. Watching her move through the world without hesitation felt like a quiet confirmation that we'd made the right choice. That afternoon, while she napped, I sat at the kitchen table with a stack of blank paper and a box of crayons. When she woke, we drew together houses, trees, shapes that didn't need interpretation. She told me stories about the pictures, each one self-contained, complete. I realized how much safety looks like this. Ordinary. Unremarkable. Consistent. Later that evening, a message from my mother appeared on my phone. Just one line. She said she hoped I was happy with the choices I'd made. I read it once and set the phone down. The words carried accusation but no curiosity. There was nothing to answer. I thought about how often I'd been asked to justify myself. How rarely I'd been asked how something felt. I understood then that happiness had never been the metric they measured by. Compliance had. And once compliance was no longer available, there was nothing left to negotiate. Nora asked me that night why we hadn't seen my parents in a long time. Her voice was neutral, observational. I told her the truth as simply as I could. That sometimes people don't know how to love in ways that are safe. That it's okay to choose distance when closeness hurts. She nodded satisfied and went back to arranging her toys. Children don't need explanations that absolve adults. They need clarity. In the days that followed, I felt the finality settle fully. Not as loss exactly. More like the end of a long negotiation I hadn't realized I was still conducting. The effort it took to manage expectations, to absorb dismissal, to translate silence into something tolerable gone. In its place was a steadier rhythm. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt aligned. Family, I learned, isn't defined by who claims you publicly. It's defined by who doesn't require you to disappear to remain welcome. By who sees your child and doesn't ask her to shrink. By who stays when nothing is being performed. The truth didn't need my defense anymore. It had outgrown the room it was once confined to. I hadn't exposed anyone. I had simply stopped participating in the erasure. That night, as I tucked Nora into bed, she wrapped her arms around my neck and held on longer than usual. Not desperately, just firmly. I stayed until her breathing evened out, then sat beside her for a while, listening to the quiet settle around us. Whatever came next, questions, distance, reinterpretation, I knew one thing with certainty. No one in this house would ever be asked to earn their place by becoming smaller, and that was enough. There's a belief many of us grow up with that family is something you endure, not something you choose. That love is proven through tolerance, through silence, through staying even when staying costs you parts of yourself. I believed that for a long time. I believed that if I could just be patient enough, calm enough, invisible enough, things would eventually even out. What I learned instead is that love that requires disappearance is not love. And connection that depends on compliance is not connection, it's control. Walking away didn't make me stronger overnight. It didn't erase grief or doubt. But it gave my daughter something I never had growing up: clarity. A home where affection doesn't shift based on convenience. Where no one is asked to earn their place by shrinking. Where safety is consistent, not conditional. Sometimes the most responsible thing you can do for yourself, for your children, is stop explaining, stop waiting, and stop negotiating with people who have already decided who matters. If any part of this story felt familiar, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening from, and what time is it there right now? Your stories matter here. And if you found value in spending this time with me, thank you for listening, for being present, and for supporting this space by liking and subscribing.